Some encounters have the power to change lives forever, while others reveal the truths that have been hiding in plain sight. This was one of those moments when an elderly black woman is harassed by two police officers who have no idea who she is. One phone call turns the tables in a way no one could have predicted. What happens when the wrong person is pushed too far? But before we dive into this astonishing story, let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Evelyn Marshall, at 73 years old, had lived long enough to know injustice when she saw it. She didn't ask for much from the world anymore. She had endured enough to recognize the signs before they even reached her doorstep. She'd felt it in the way people locked their car doors when she passed by, the way store clerks trailed just a bit too closely behind her, and the way neighbors peered out of their windows as she walked down the block in her Sunday best. Some things never changed, but this was different. Evelyn had just finished her weekly grocery run at a small local store, one of the few businesses that hadn't been overtaken by gentrification. The plastic bags cut into her hands as she walked slowly toward her car, her back aching from years of carrying burdens that weren't hers to bear. She had just placed her bags in the trunk when she heard it, a sharp, commanding whistle, one that wasn't meant for animals or friends, but for control. "Ma'am." Evelyn adjusted her glasses, raising an eyebrow as she took in the sight of two uniformed officers approaching her. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that obscured his eyes. The other, a shorter, younger officer with that rookie energy, shifting on his feet as if unsure why they were even stopping her. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. "Need to see some ID," the taller officer said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who expected immediate obedience. Evelyn frowned. "Excuse me?" "Just a routine check, ma'am," the rookie interjected, his voice softer but uncertain. "We got a report about suspicious activity in the area." Suspicious activity. Evelyn pressed her lips together in a thin line. She'd lived in this neighborhood longer than most of the houses had even been built. She'd watched the streets change, seen the faces shift from familiar to foreign. But suspicious activity? The only thing suspicious about her right now was the color of her skin to men who saw a threat where there was none. "And what activity might that be?" she asked, crossing her arms. The taller officer lifted his chin. "Just show us some ID and we'll be on our way." A flicker of heat stirred in her chest, a familiar anger she had spent years learning to tame. She had heard these words before. She had heard them at 16, walking home from church when officers claimed she matched the description. She had heard them again at 35 when she was pulled over for a tail light that wasn't even broken. She had heard them all her life. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. "I'm just an old woman trying to get home with my groceries. You see my car, you see my bags. What exactly do you think I've done?" The taller officer smirked, leaning in slightly. "Just following procedures, ma'am." Her fingers twitched at her sides. "Procedures for what?" "Existing," the officer replied, his voice sharp. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to cooperate." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "And I need you to tell me what crime I've committed." For a moment, the taller officer stiffened, and the rookie seemed to realize that something was off. Perhaps, for the first time, he was questioning why they were harassing a grandmother in a flowered blouse with aching knees and a tired soul. But the taller officer, he had already made up his mind. His hand hovered over the radio at his shoulder. "Are you refusing to comply?" he demanded, his voice taking on a threatening tone. There it was, the threat. The unspoken warning that things could turn sideways quickly if Evelyn didn't fall in line. She took a slow, steadying breath. She had survived Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, redlining, and a lifetime of being treated as less than. And yet somehow she still had to justify her right to simply exist in her own neighborhood. Without hesitation, she reached into her purse, not for her ID, but for something far more powerful, her phone. The rookie tensed, watching her every move. But Evelyn didn't rush. She had learned long ago that sudden moves could cost people like her their lives. She scrolled through her contacts, tapped a name, and held the phone to her ear. The taller officer frowned. "Who are you calling?" he demanded. Evelyn didn't answer. The line rang once, twice, then a voice on the other end, sharp and professional. A slow smile curled at the corners of Evelyn's lips as she tilted her head slightly, letting her eyes linger on the officers just long enough for doubt to creep into their expressions. "Hello, baby," she said, her voice light and conversational, as if she wasn't standing in the middle of a grocery store parking lot, being interrogated for nothing more than her presence. "I seem to be having a little trouble here," she continued, her words cool as she held their attention. The phone call only lasted a moment, but it was enough to change everything. Two officers had stopped Evelyn, demanding her ID for no apparent reason. A brief pause, and then the voice on the other end of the line sharpened. "Where are you?" The taller officer's smirk faltered, and he exchanged a look with his partner. The rookie's face had gone ashen. Evelyn turned, giving both officers a slow, deliberate glance. "Oh, just outside Thompson's Market," she said casually, letting the words sink in. There was a long silence, followed by a clipped, professional response on the other end. "Stay put." Evelyn smiled and slipped her phone back into her purse. "Oh, I will." For the first time, the taller officer's confidence wavered. Who, who was that?" he stammered. Evelyn adjusted the strap of her purse, taking her time before answering. Then, with a voice as steady as a judge's gavel, she said, "My daughter." She let that settle for a moment, watching the confusion flicker across their faces. "And what does your daughter do?" the rookie asked, his voice edged with apprehension. Evelyn gave him a long, knowing look. "She's the United States Attorney General." The words hit the officers like a hammer. The taller officer stiffened, his lips parting slightly, as if he had just realized he had stepped off a cliff. The rookie swallowed hard, his throat bobbing in nervous tension. Evelyn just adjusted her glasses and smiled. "Now, officers," she said, her voice cool and controlled, "would you like to see my ID, or would you rather wait for my daughter to arrive?" For the first time that day, neither officer had a word to say. The silence between Evelyn and the officers stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. The taller officer, whose face had been set in stone just moments ago, now seemed to be calculating. The rookie shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching at his sides, unsure whether he should stand firm or back away completely. Evelyn, however, remained perfectly still, not afraid, not panicked, just watching. "Ma'am," the taller officer began, clearing his throat, "we're just doing our job." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what job is that exactly?" The officer squared his shoulders again, trying to regain the authority that had just slipped from his grasp. "Making sure everything checks out." Evelyn let out a quiet chuckle, one that wasn't amused but filled with understanding. The kind of laugh that said, "I've seen this before. I've seen you before." "Well," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse, "I suppose we'll see if everything checks out when my daughter gets here." A muscle twitched in the taller officer's jaw. The rookie's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, as if he wanted to melt into the pavement. "You don't have to call anyone," the taller officer said, his tone shifting from hard authority to something far too forced, as if he were trying to smooth over a situation that had begun to spiral. "Weaken?" "I already did," Evelyn responded without raising her voice. She didn't need to. The power of her words alone sent a ripple through the air, making the officer stand a little straighter, a little more uncertain. The taller officer licked his lips. "Ma'am, look, we weren't—" "You were," Evelyn cut in, her voice calm but firm. "And you still are." A small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the tension in the air. The grocery store, usually a place where neighbors caught up with each other, now felt like a stage for something much bigger. An older black man in a plaid button-up stood with his arms crossed, watching. A young mother held her child's hand tightly, shaking her head. A cashier in an apron peeked out from behind the glass doors, eyeing the scene. The officers noticed the crowd too. The rookie took half a step back, suddenly aware of how many eyes were now on them. The taller officer, however, wasn't ready to back down, at least not yet. He turned toward the growing crowd and offered them a tight, almost rehearsed smile. "Folks," he said, his voice strained, "there's nothing to see here. Please go about your day." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The weight of the moment hung heavy, like the pressure before a storm. Then the sound of a car approaching fast sliced through the air. A sleek black sedan pulled up so quickly it almost seemed to materialize out of nowhere. It stopped just a few feet away from where they stood, the hum of the engine cutting through the tension. When the door opened, a woman stepped out who commanded the street without even trying. Tall, poised, and dressed in a dark navy suit, her presence swallowed the scene whole. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to adjust her stance. The moment she shut the car door, she owned every second of what happened next. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, the same deep brown as Evelyn's, locked onto the officers. "Which one of you put your hands on my mother?" Her voice was the kind that made rooms fall silent, the kind that made powerful men shift uncomfortably in their seats. It carried weight, history, and the promise that if there was injustice, it would be answered for. The taller officer's confidence, already cracking, shattered completely. "No one put their hands on her," he said quickly, stepping back as if he just realized the ground beneath him had crumbled. The taller officer's authority, which he had tried to wield just moments ago, evaporated. "Good." Vanessa took a step closer. "Because if you had," she said, her voice low but sharp, "we'd be having a very different conversation right now." The rookie took another step back, barely breathing. The taller officer, still trying to regain control, opened his mouth. "Look," he began, his voice losing its edge. "We didn't know who she was. Vanessa's daughter, the United States Attorney General." Vanessa Marshall tilted her head slightly, but her expression remained unchanged. However, the subtle shift in her body language said enough. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade being drawn from its sheath. The officer swallowed, clearly unnerved. "So, you mean to tell me," Vanessa said, her voice now steady and unwavering, "that if my mother wasn't my mother, if she was just another black woman minding her own business, you would have treated her differently? Is that what you're telling me?" The officer opened his mouth again, but no words came out. He had nowhere to go. Vanessa didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she turned slightly, scanning the small crowd of people that had gathered, still watching. "How many of you know my mother?" she asked, her voice effortlessly reaching everyone around her. A chorus of voices responded almost immediately. "She's been here longer than anyone," one voice said. "She taught at the elementary school for decades." "Everybody knows Miss Evelyn," another chimed in. "She watched my kids when I had to work late." Vanessa turned back to the officers, her expression hardening. "These people," she said, her words deliberate, "they know who she is. And yet you didn't. You assumed. You harassed her. And now what? You want to explain it away? You want to act like this was just a misunderstanding?" Neither officer said a word. Vanessa took another step closer, her voice quieting just enough to make them lean in. "Let me tell you something," she said, her tone cutting through the silence. "I have spent my entire career holding men like you accountable. I know every law, every policy, every loophole you think you can hide behind. And if you think for 1 second that this ends with you walking away without consequences—" She let the sentence hang, unfinished, but the promise of what was coming next was clear. The taller officer straightened as if about to say something, but Vanessa had already turned away from him. She faced Evelyn now, her face softening in the way it only did for her mother. "You okay, Mama?" Evelyn, who had remained still and patient throughout the entire ordeal, nodded with a small smile. "I'm fine, baby," she said, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's arm. "Just tired." Vanessa exhaled, some of the tension in her shoulders loosening. She nodded once and then turned back to the officers. "You two," she said firmly, "are going to hand over your badge numbers and full names right now. And then you're going to go back to your department and let them know that this," she gestured between them, "is far from over." The rookie didn't hesitate. He pulled out a notepad, scribbled down his information, and handed it over. The taller officer, though, hesitated just a fraction too long. Vanessa didn't flinch. "I will make one phone call and have your entire precinct on their knees by sunset," she said, her voice unwavering. "Do you really want to test that?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, but he handed over his badge number. Vanessa took the papers, tucking them into her pocket as though they were no more significant than receipts. Without another glance at the officers, she turned back to Evelyn. "Let's go home, Mama." And just like that, it was over. Or at least, for now. The moment Evelyn and Vanessa left the grocery store parking lot, the world outside began to shift. This wasn't just another case of police harassment that would fade into the folds of the news cycle. Not this time. By the time they reached Evelyn's home, a modest, well-kept house with a porch swing that had held more memories than some people had years, Vanessa's phone was already vibrating nonstop. Texts, emails, calls. People who knew people, who had already heard, who wanted statements. Evelyn watched her daughter navigate it all with that same calm, steely presence she had always admired. It didn't matter that Vanessa was one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. To Evelyn, she was still the little girl who used to sit cross-legged on the floor, highlighting passages in law books too heavy for her tiny hands. Vanessa finally let out a breath and placed her phone face down on the table. "Well," she said, rubbing her temple, "I hope those officers enjoy the next few hours because they have no idea what's coming." Evelyn sipped her tea, watching her daughter carefully. "What exactly is coming?" Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, the kind of expression that usually preceded the dismantling of an entire case. "Accountability," she said quietly, leaning forward with her elbows resting on the table. "Internal Affairs is already on it. The precinct is under review. Body cam footage will be released by tomorrow morning." Evelyn shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "Body cam footage," she echoed. "That's what it takes?" Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Now proof." "It shouldn't have to be," Evelyn agreed, her voice soft but firm. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down between them. Evelyn had lived through too much to be naive. She had witnessed men in uniforms, with more power than they deserved, walk away from worse. She had seen people protest, beg, and demand justice, only to be handed excuses and unfortunate misunderstandings in return. And yet this time, she had something she had never had before, a daughter with the power to change the ending. Vanessa's phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up. She barely had time to say hello before the voice on the other end launched into a frantic spiel. Evelyn could hear the urgency, the clipped, anxious words spilling out. Vanessa nodded once, twice, then said, "Send me the statement. I'll approve it." She ended the call, took a breath, and looked up at her mother. "It's already everywhere. News stations are covering it. Social media is running wild. They're calling it grocery store profiling." Evelyn let out a small, tired laugh. "They had to give it a name, huh?" "They always do," Vanessa replied, her tone flat. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, but Evelyn knew it wouldn't last. She had seen the looks in people's eyes back at the store, felt the shift in the air. This wasn't just about her anymore. Vanessa stood, rolling her shoulders back. "I need to make a few calls. This isn't just about those two officers. It's bigger than them." Evelyn nodded, watching her daughter step into the living room, already moving, already strategizing. This was what Vanessa did. She took injustice and turned it into battle plans. She took violations and turned them into legal reckonings. Evelyn picked up her tea again, but before she could take a sip, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't surprised when she opened it and found familiar faces standing on the other side. Neighbors, friends, people she had known for years, and some she barely recognized. But all of them had the same look in their eyes. Anger, determination. "Miss Evelyn," said Mr. Green from two houses down, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite rage but was close enough. "We heard what happened. We're not letting this slide." Evelyn sighed, stepping back and gesturing for them to come in. She knew deep down this wasn't just about her anymore. It never was. Within minutes, her living room was full. Conversations overlapped. Voices rose and fell, full of shared frustration, of questions about what came next. "Do we protest?" someone asked. "Do we demand those cops get fired?" "We can't let this be another one of those stories that just fades away." Another voice chimed in. Vanessa reappeared from the hallway, her presence commanding the room the moment she stepped into it. Conversation stopped. All eyes shifted to her. "I know everyone's angry," Vanessa said, her voice firm but measured. "And you should be." She looked around the room, taking in the faces, the concern, the exhaustion. This isn't new, she continued. We all know that. My mother knows that better than anyone. Evelyn felt the weight of her daughter's words, that the truth in them. But here's what we can do, Vanessa went on. We make sure this doesn't disappear. We make sure those officers are held accountable, and we demand better. Not just for my mother, but for everyone else who doesn't have a daughter sitting in the U.S. Attorney General's office. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. We have the media's attention, Vanessa said, her voice unwavering. We use it. Let them tell the story, but we make sure it's our story. Evelyn watched as the people around her, people who had felt helpless for so long, began to sit up straighter. A woman near the doorway, someone Evelyn recognized from the local church, spoke up. What can we do? Vanessa's gaze swept across the room. Her mind was already moving 100 miles ahead. Show up, speak up, share the footage when it drops. Write, call, make them listen. The energy in the room shifted again, this time no longer just frustration, but action. Evelyn sat back, watching as her daughter took control of the storm. She had always been strong, but now she was unstoppable. Vanessa took a deep breath, glancing at her watch. I need to go back to D.C. by morning, but before I do, we make sure the next steps are clear. Evelyn smiled softly, proud even through the exhaustion. The battle had begun, and for once, the ending wouldn't be written by the same hands that had always held the pen. The next morning, the city woke before the sun. The story had exploded overnight, traveling from social media to national news in the blink of an eye. The video from the grocery store, recorded by a bystander who had quietly captured the entire exchange, had gone viral. The footage showed everything. The way the officers had approached Evelyn without cause, the way their tones had shifted once she made that call, the way their postures had stiffened when Vanessa arrived. Her presence alone was enough to unravel their confidence, and now there was no stopping it. By mid-morning, news outlets were running with the story, the momentum growing by the minute. Lines of reporters lined the street outside Evelyn's home, microphones in hand, waiting. They weren't alone. The community had shown up too. People stood in groups, holding signs, speaking in low voices. They weren't protesting, not yet, but they were there to make it clear this wasn't just another headline. Inside, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, watching as Vanessa moved through the room like a strategist preparing for battle. Calls were made, emails were sent, statements were drafted. Vanessa had done this before, but never like this. Never for her own mother. Evelyn reached for her daughter's wrist, stilling her movement. Vanessa, she said, her voice calm, the kind that had always steadied her daughter, even when she was a little girl pacing before a spelling bee. Vanessa finally exhaled, setting her phone down. I know, Mama. I need to slow down. Evelyn chuckled, shaking her head. You don't know how. Vanessa smirked but said nothing, fully aware her mother was right. A knock at the door sent a ripple through the house. Evelyn and Vanessa exchanged a glance before Vanessa moved to answer it. The moment she opened the door, the man on the other side took a careful step back, hands clasped in front of him. Attorney General Marshall, he greeted, his badge clipped to his belt, his suit crisp, and his expression unreadable. Evelyn recognized the look instantly, a man sent to control a situation he no longer had a handle on. Vanessa nodded once. Chief Reynolds, she said. The police chief cleared his throat. May I come in? Vanessa glanced past him, noting the two officers standing at the curb, eyes lowered, hands resting near their belts, before stepping aside to allow him in. Evelyn didn't stand. She didn't move. She simply watched as Chief Reynolds entered, his eyes flickering briefly to her before settling back on Vanessa. Let's get to it, Vanessa said, folding her arms. The chief hesitated before pulling out a chair across from Evelyn. I want to personally apologize for what happened yesterday. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. What exactly are you apologizing for? The chief blinked. For the way my officers treated you. Evelyn nodded slowly. And how exactly do you think they treated me? There it was, the weight of accountability hanging in the air between them. The chief shifted in his seat, clearing his throat again. I reviewed the footage, he admitted. It was unacceptable. Evelyn stared at him, unmoving. Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms still crossed. Unacceptable, Vanessa repeated, her tone unreadable. That's the word we're going with. The chief's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, and I want you to know we're taking action. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, the faintest trace of amusement flickering in her eyes. Leave, she echoed. Paid, I assume. The chief hesitated. For now, yes. Vanessa let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Chief, let's not play this game. We both know how this works. Leave means nothing. It's a pause button, not a consequence. The chief sighed, rubbing his temples. What would you like to see happen? Vanessa straightened her stance, shifting from casual to commanding in an instant. Termination. The chief's eyes flickered with something unreadable. That's the bare minimum, he stammered. Vanessa interrupted, her voice sharp. Your officers profiled my mother. They harassed her. They would have escalated if she had reacted the way so many others do. If she had been afraid instead of composed, we both know that. Evelyn watched as the chief took a slow breath, as the weight of Vanessa's words settled in his chest. I understand, he said finally, and I'll take that into serious consideration. Vanessa's jaw clenched. That's not enough. The chief met her gaze. Then what do you suggest? Vanessa didn't hesitate. A public statement, full transparency, the release of body cam footage, uncut. And I want those officers to answer for their actions. The chief nodded slowly, as if turning the request over in his mind. Then finally he exhaled. I can do that. Vanessa didn't look relieved. Not yet. And the officers, she pressed. The chief hesitated. They'll be dealt with. That's not an answer. The chief held her gaze. After a long pause, he nodded once. They won't be back. Vanessa studied him for a moment, as if gauging his sincerity. Then she nodded. Good. The chief turned to Evelyn, his expression softer now. Mrs. Marshall, I truly am sorry. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice even. I've heard that before. The chief swallowed. I know. Evelyn studied him for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod. The conversation was over. The chief stood, adjusting his suit before offering Vanessa one last nod. You'll have my statement by the end of the day. Vanessa stepped aside, allowing him to leave. The moment the door shut, the weight of the room shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it loosened. Vanessa turned back to her mother. Well? Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea before answering. We'll see. Vanessa let out a small laugh, shaking her head. You're impossible. Evelyn smiled. And you're relentless. Outside, the world was still waiting. The cameras, the community, the eyes of everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, or doubted simply for existing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for once, Evelyn didn't feel powerless. For once, she wasn't just another name in a story with the same ending. This time, the ending was still being written.